Association and National Association of Insurance and Financial Advisors have each launched large-scale change initiatives recently to be more responsive to member needs and market shifts. As a result, they are positioned to be more member-centric and more valuable to their member communities. Katie and Kevin, thank you for joining Save the Associations. All right, let's start with two stats. I'm curious to know, first stat, what's a stat or data point that emerged a year or two ago, which indicated to your organizations that there was the need for urgent or significant change? And then the second stat I would love for you to share is a stat that describes your current success and happens to be the direct result of a significant change in your membership strategy. All right, Katie, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit and say my first stat is not from the last year, but we really have undergone an entire rebrand of our organization. And before I came on board, the organization had lost about 50% of its revenue. And because of a number of departures from really large members. And at the end of this year, we announced a 30% increase in membership over a less than 1 year period of time. So those are my two stats and are a quick look at the journey that we have been on here at Consumer Brands, which we call the 100-year-old startup.
Yes, because if you will just share for our viewers, you recently rebranded from one association to another. Do you want to just explain that real quick?
So the organization, the Grocery Manufacturers Association, has been around Washington for over 100 years, a long time, and had undergone a number of changes that sort of put it in the place that it was. We went under new leadership about 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago. And along with that, a new CEO who brought in an entirely new executive team. And I was one of those people that were brought on. And we last year announced a new organization, the Consumer Brands Association. And you'll notice I said a new organization because we really were an organization that wasn't just a name change or a new logo. It was an entirely new strategic agenda and a path forward for what we wanted to be as an association in Washington today.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Okay, Kevin, two stats. Share what first emerged to say, oh my gosh, we have to make a change. And then what's a stat that kind of shows the success of the changes you've made in the past year or so?
Well, Sarah, I would say that the first stat is kind of amazing, and it's 27 years of membership decline. And NAFA is the largest association, professional association of the insurance and financial services space. And we've been around for 131 years. But since the early 90s, our membership had been declining year after year after year after year. And so we really had a wake-up call, which we probably should have turned into a long time ago. And that's we needed to change, and we needed to be nimble, and we needed to be much more member-centric, or else we weren't going to be around that much longer. And I think that a more recent stat to kind of illustrate the success of our change is the number 30,000. And that's the number of people that logged on to NAFA programs online in this virtual type setting last year alone. 30,000 unique logins, people that were paying attention and joining in our programs. And with that, I'll add a bonus stat in there. We were able to see a 104% growth in a 1 year period. So we're growing, we're turning this big ship around, and we're getting people engaged because we're being nimble as in what we're doing.
Okay, so each of you have a history. You would be considered legacy associations in many ways. And so let's just, because the large scale initiatives, and because we have people tuning in who might be running smaller organizations, I want to distill it down to 3 strategies in particular. So what 3 strategies would you say have had the greatest impact on membership growth? And Kevin, we'll start with you, please.
Okay, so great. Again, like you mentioned, we are a 130 plus year old legacy organization. But with that, we had 600 different components, which were independent associations at the local and state level. And they all kind of operated separately. And with that, they had separate due structures. And so when somebody would say, hey, I'm interested in joining, how much does it cost? We'd have to say, well, what's your zip code? Because we'd have to look it up and look at what your local dues were and your state dues were and add it into the national dues. We streamlined that and changed it to one uniform due structure across the country. So it's the same thing to join whether you're in Tampa, Florida, or you're in Tacoma, Washington. It's the same nationwide. So that was one thing. The second thing was we also know in the insurance and financial services space, the people that begin as an advisor, it takes a while for them to build a book of business. And maybe they can't afford the same professional dues that you would be able to pay later in life. And so we came up with a tiered due structure to allow people that are new to the profession to join at a lower price point, but also along the way for us to provide them the training and support they need to be successful in this industry. And then the third thing was we wanted to make sure that all of our members could differentiate themselves versus others. There are other peers out there in the space that aren't members. And so with that, we started using our social media platforms to highlight our members and talk about how they're trusted advisors and be able to put in front of consumers the fact that if you're looking for somebody to meet your insurance or financial services needs, go to a NAIFA member and here's people in your community that can help you. And so we're hoping through that spotlighting that we add much more value and ROI for our members than what they get out of their dues. So those are three things we're doing.
That's excellent. Katie, 3 strategies that Consumer Brands Association has noticed has made the most significant impact on membership.
So the first would be the rebrand. And I think we had a long history, some good and some bad. And I think an important first step for us was to rebrand who we are and where we were headed as an organization. And you'll notice before the name was the Grocery Manufacturers Association. And the first thing people often heard was grocery, which made them think retail, when in fact we represent the consumer packaged goods industry, the people who make the stuff that's in the grocery stores. So it was very deliberate that we put consumer in our name. And then second would be a really wholesale refurbish of our agenda. And the agenda is it's focused. It's very strategically focused on the consumer because our members are public facing brands and the calculus that they go through in making decisions are very different than a calculus an organization might make who isn't consumer facing. So a rebrand, a consumer centric agenda. And then the third piece would be to leverage everything that we set up over the last 2 years during the pandemic. And I think it was an opportunity for us to show up for our membership in a way that the organization had never shown up before. And it really did pay dividends for us as an organization.
So I'm curious because you're becoming really more valuable to each of your industries as a result of the changes that you've made, and you've definitely become more member-centric. How have these decisions, some pretty big, large-scale changes and decisions, how have they positively impacted or changed the trajectory of the association overall? Katie, would you like to comment?
Sure. I think what's interesting about our situation was in many ways we had to stop doing things that we were doing for a lot of members, which is a hard thing to communicate because if you get accustomed to getting a certain number of services, over time you just expect them. And I think with our focused agenda came a certain level of discipline that we had to have as an association to say, we're not doing that anymore. So it sounds sort of counterintuitive of we're going to do less, but we're becoming more member-centric. And I think, for us, it was about how do we best use the resources we have to make the most impact for the entirety of the industry. And we represent cleaning products, we represent personal care products, we represent food and beverages. And what we wanted to do was to create an agenda that united the entirety of the industry. And we weren't out fighting the fight of aisle 2 and then fighting the fight of aisle 3. That everything that we were doing brought together the aisles 2 through 9 in the grocery store to advance what we were doing for our members. And I think that's the role of a trade association, is to unite the entirety of the industry to and advance an agenda that is most effective for the industry. And if you're fighting the fight of aisle 2 and fighting the fight of aisle 9, you're not focused on the things that make the most impact.
Can you give us an example of one of those things that you stopped doing?
We had over 100 committees at our organization. We had a committee for committees. So we did a wholesale elimination of our committees. And then we came back and said, okay, based on the agenda that we've outlined, what committees really make sense? So we aren't just meeting for the sake of meeting. And while it may have affected individual staff members at some of our member companies, it really wasn't part of an overall strategic agenda for the industry or for the organization. And so that was one that was hard to do, but I think in the long run, it was the right thing for us to do for both the organization and our members.
Okay, Kevin, so changes at NAFA, how have these large-scale changes influenced the trajectory of the association overall?
Well, they've actually been quite good, because what it's done is it's let us basically tell our message in 2 parts. One, tell our members the work that we're doing on their behalf every day when it comes to public policy and professional development and other things, but also help tell the public again about the critical role that our members play in helping 90 million American families secure their financial future. And so it's been able to help us do both things. Again, internally stress that value prop, but also externally help tell the larger story as to what the larger profession does and the good that it does for American society, and help spotlight our members as being folks that everyday Americans can turn to help them put together their right financial plan so that their own house is in order in case they need, funds for retirement, or if there happens to be an unfortunate circumstance that happens, that they've got the right life protection products in place. So it's been tremendous. And by us focusing on the member and telling their story, it also helps public policymakers understand how things impact real world folks. It's not just an esoteric conversation where you give some stats, but when you can tell a story about what happened down in Main Street, USA, and how something impacts the person who's a police officer, a firefighter, or a school teacher, just average everyday folks, it really helps the message resonate with public policy folks as they're considering policies to adopt or not to adopt, or what they might do to amend them so that they're more beneficial to better help Americans prepare for their financial future.
And was there anything that NAFA had to stop doing in order to allow for this new focus?
Oh, quite a bit. One of the hardest things to do in association management is stop doing something. We're all great, all of us as association professionals, at figuring out new things to do and new programs to bring on board and new ways we can serve our members. But it's also difficult to sit back and say, hey, but we have to realize there's a limited amount of resources out there, whether that be time, bandwidth, staff hours, or just financial resources available to get things done. So you have to be prepared to either turn down the spigot on some things or just turn things off altogether. And then for us, that really meant some things that might be sacred cows, they might have outlived their usefulness if members aren't really actively engaging or consuming or participating in that program or service. And so with that stuff, maybe you need to reposition it, or maybe you need to put it on the back burner or turn it off altogether. And so we had to go through an exercise of sunsetting a few things, of changing the way we had done business instead of just piling on, and then focusing our time and our attention on the things that were the biggest value add for each of our members across the country.
Sure. So in your opinion, as associations are tuning in to the show and they're asking themselves, some of them are really grappling with this idea of change. And so I'm curious to know, what is your advice? Where should they start? What is the most important thing for them to be doing right now to ensure that they can save their associations and have a prosperous future? Katie, your thoughts on that?
I think finding the value proposition for your membership, because at the end of the day, if you haven't clearly identified is what can you bring to them that they can't bring to themselves, you aren't going to be able to articulate a value proposition that warrants dues, payments, that warrants participation in events, all of the things that drive revenue for an organization. And I think it all comes back to what's the value proposition.
Very good. Kevin?
I agree wholeheartedly with Katie. But you've also got to remember that, the world is a changing, dynamic place. And so just because you had something that your organization was doing a year or 5 years or 10 years ago may not be relevant in today's workplace. I mean, all of us have experienced the dramatic changes that we've all had to go through due to the pandemic. And we just, by meeting like this much more often, in fact, pretty much exclusively now, it just shows that, we've adapted a lot as an association management community over the course of the past year. So I would say, be nimble, make sure you stress that member value proposition, but also make sure that your culture in your organization is ready for change and is willing to embrace change and think about new ways of doing things, but at all times staying focused on your member. Because if you're not, and then you don't have members, we don't have jobs.
Exactly. My final question, I would like to know how in each of your organizations change actually happened. So you recognize the need for change, and we've talked about the strategies that you've introduced. But in the middle there, people had to be involved to make the change possible. We find a lot of associations struggle with this particular process. So did you make the change by committee, by task force, as leadership, as board? How did your organizations get the change going? Kevin, you want to start, please?
I would say answer E, all of the above for that. And it's really culture change has got to involve everybody, or it's not going to take deep root. So what we started to do almost 6 years ago, we put in place a new strategic plan for the organization. But it wasn't a plan that was developed by the board or by the staff. It was developed by a cross section of our members across the country. And then along the way, we gave opportunities for others to give input and feedback and comment into it. And with that, we put a lot of different fingerprints on the plan. And then part of that plan was creating a culture of accountability, a culture of getting results, a culture of transparency, and then doing what we said we were going to do. And with that, that builds faith and trust and confidence, but it also builds buy-in because people believe that they had a key role in helping make that product become the final product. And so people help support what they help create. And so we try to do that. And we did that again by involving all those different audiences that you talked about.
Katie, how did change happen at Consumer Brands Association?
I think one thing that Kevin said was transparency. And I think that was at the core of what we were doing. And we basically were starting from scratch in many ways, which is a great opportunity. It's really fun just to think of, okay, if you're going to create this from the ground up, what does it look like? And for us, transparency was the key because in many ways, our strategy was evolving as we learned information, as we got feedback from the board. Our strategy was evolving to meet that input. And then as it was evolving, we were regularly communicating with the staff to get the buy-in that Kevin said is so important. So you've got the board buy-in, which is sort of is imperative for going and doing. But once you've got that board buy-in, you want to make sure you're bringing everybody else along with you as you're on that journey. And I think transparency, buy-in, and creativity and flexibility on the side is the recipe for success.
Well, thank you, Katie and Kevin, for sharing your insights with our audience today. As is customary of this show, at the end of every episode, I ask people to do a celebratory dance. So if you'll join me in doing some dance moves, we're just celebrating all the success that you've had. And thank you for all you have done to help save the association.